This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Yo.
And tonight, we're going metal, as in heavy metal. And to discuss heavy metal, we've brought in an expert, DJ and music teacher, Richard Moule.
Hi, gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me on your show. I have been an avid fan of your podcast, so it's a pleasure and honor to be invited to come in and discuss this subject with you.
I should make a correction. You're a music history teacher, not a teacher of music itself, even though you are actually a musician as well.
Yeah, I do teach music history. Even though I can play an instrument in a rudimentary way. No, I'm more a music history buff and an improviser as well.
Right. So we've brought you on, Richard, of course, because heavy metal is perhaps the nerdliest of all forms of music, and there's a long history of nerddom being connected with heavy metal in many ways, shapes, and forms, which we'll get into later. But first, I thought we should probably do a little bit of a background, because there's some of our listeners may not be that familiar with heavy metal, or they may not be familiar with its origins or roots. So, Richard, why don't you tell us a little bit about them?
Okay, well, heavy metal comes out of what we call hard rock, which was the music that emerged from bands like The Who and Cream and Jimi Hendrix, and even to a lesser extent with the Beatles, with songs like Helter Skelter at the end of the 1960s. Now, in terms of coming up with a definition of what heavy metal is, we'll probably get into that in a little more depth, but the origins are ambiguous. We know it's a phrase that's been used in chemistry and metallurgy. Mm-hmm. I mean, when you talk about the periodic table and talk about light and heavy metals, like a heavy metal like uranium, mm-hmm. that's a term that be used in chemistry and metallurgy. We also know that one of the first references to the term, and one of the first times that we used in fiction, which was in a story by William Burroughs. And,
really?
Yeah. So the British band The Soft Machine gave themselves that moniker after the William Burroughs novel, and in that novel there is a character entitled Uranium Willie, the Heavy Metal Kid. And in Burroughs' next novel, Nova Express in 1964, Soft Machine came out in 1962, develops the theme with heavy metal as a metaphor for addictive drugs. So there's a fantasy and sort of sci-fi deviant element which you would associate with Burroughs' novels.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
And I know that he also used it, I think he used it in another novel as well. So Burroughs, at least in a literature context, was one of the first people to use the phrase. We know that of course, the Steppenwolf song, mm-hmm. Born to be Wild.
Yeah, right.
I like Smoke Lightning, Heavy Metal Thunder, Racing with the Wind, and That Feeling I'm Under. Mm-hmm. So it has that background The first people to use it, well, they're, if you go to look on Wikipedia, various people, various critics take credit for the first references to it. So there's on Wikipedia they talk about a critic named Barry Gifford in an 1868 edition of Rolling Stone reviewing a blues band, Electric Flag, and making reference to the music was a synthesis of white blues and heavy metal rock. The band Blue Cheer is being referred to as one of the first heavy rock or heavy metal bands. Another critic, Mike Saunders, in a review of an album by the Humble Pie, of course, featured Peter Frampton, again uses the word heavy metal to refer to the heaviness and loudness and use of distortion. So the term was in the air, but to my mind, gentlemen, when I was growing up, heavy metal and hard rock were the same thing. So, in fact, I don't remember when hard rock became heavy metal. So when people suddenly, this music that I always thought had roots, with, as I said, to bands like Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin and Cream and The Who and the Kinks with You Really Got Me, they were suddenly referred to as being the pioneers of heavy metal. I was I thought it was just rock or hard rock. So, so who's the first heavy metal band? Well, I guess that's given to Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
But again, they have never seen themselves as a heavy metal band, and they've sort of accepted the mantle. And if you go to any kind of reference guide or book, Sabbath are listed as the pioneers of heavy metal, whether they liked it or not.
They have no choice in the matter.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, that's sort of the etymology of the word and a little bit of where the term was and some of the bands associated with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so if heavy metal started with Sabbath, when did Sabbath actually begin then?
Sabbath begins in, I believe, Sabbath begins in 68. Is it
right?
Is it 68, 60, 69? That the first Sabbath album was released. Let me just double.
Yeah, I think you're right, but I think they were something else before that, kind of, weren't they?
Yeah. So the first album came out in 1970. So to begin the new decade. So the order of Sabbath albums are Black Sabbath, self-titled 1970, Paranoid the same year,
Yeah.
Masters Reality 71, Volume 4 72, and Sabbath Bloody Sabbath 73, and after 73 it starts to get gets a little weird. So
Gets
in
weird.
terms of there are a lot of the fractious nature of the way that drugs seem to take over the band, but
Yeah.
1970. That was it's funny about Sabbath. They as I said, they started a genre of hard rock unbeknownst to them. We've all heard the opening to Black Sabbath with the rain and the thunder. It's obviously taken from their love of Hammer movies and Dennis Wheatley books, and then the banging of the gong and that tritone riff, and suddenly millions of bands around the world hear this and think, hey, this is something we've never heard before. Or
Right.
and I think the thing to keep in mind about heavy metal is that it is a less blues oriented music, even though, I mean, they were, Black Sabbath were huge blues fans, and their early band were doing blues covers, and Bill Ward is a huge jazz album. The first two Sabbath albums are swing like crazy. I mean, they are almost as much sort of heavy folk jazz records as they are the pioneers of heavy metal. So,
well, it's interesting that the very first heavy metal band has a name, Black Sabbath, that's associated with magic and mysticism and fantasy.
Yeah. Absolutely. So gentlemen, when was the first time you heard heavy metal?
The term or the style?
How about both, Don? What was the first time you heard the term or heard the music?
Okay, it's interesting that you make that mention that a lot of the earliest metal bands don't count themselves as that, because I think that got retroactively added to a bunch. Because I can remember, like, Sabbath was considered hard rock. Kiss was just a rock band, and they're considered, like, metal now. The first time I'd really heard the term was probably around 79 or 80 being applied to Judas Priest.
Yeah, and that would probably be a legitimate reference, because by that time they would have seen themselves as a heavy metal band and very much embracing the genre. So yeah, that makes it, and that seems like a natural connection.
And I think too with that was, I think Priest might have been the first one that people thought of, and around that time, because that would be around British Steel.
Mm-hmm.
Would be the first one that we would recognize as metal, because their first few albums, right up to, I think, what was it, Sad Wings of Destiny was their first. That's very, like, even though it came out in the early 70s, it's very, like, 1960s psychedelic sounding. Like, it doesn't sound like what we would consider metal nowadays.
Absolutely, you're right, Don. I mean, and the funny, I mean, it sounds like prog that they don't. The funny thing about that record is that it's very much rooted in hard blues and blues rock, but they listen to a lot of prog rock, but they're not skilled enough and technically proficient enough to pull it off. I mean, they weren't Genesis, they weren't Yes, they weren't ELP or King Crimson. They were guys who just didn't have the technical facility. So as much as I like that record, I'm getting a lot of trouble. I don't think it quite works. Whereas with an album like British Steel and tracks like Breaking the Law and Living After Midnight, they streamlined their sound. They found that they were a groove oriented band, and with power riffs and double leads, and they were on their way to mega stardom.
Yeah.
To answer your question for me, now this is where my nerd cred is going to go through the roof, or I'm going to look incredibly bad in a second. My first real I was aware of heavy metal. I was aware, I'd heard the term, like kids in my kids in my elementary school classes would wear things like Black Sabbath t-shirts. I remember Black Sabbath t-shirts in elementary school. But my first actual awareness of heavy metal as a music genre that I actually listened to and thought, hey, I actually kind of like this, would actually come in 1987 with the release of a very specific movie. And this is where I get totally geeky for a second. Transformers the movie.
Oh, okay.
The original animated one that came out in 1987, which has, the main metal band on there is Spectre General.
Mm-hmm.
They did a good chunk of the album. It is Transformers the movie, so it's heavy metal, obviously. And I love that soundtrack to death. And so in a weird way, that soundtrack got me into metal. So I got in through Lion, Spectre General, Energy, and the other bands that were on that soundtrack. Really, they rocked my world for a little while. And although I didn't go so far as actually buying like metal albums or anything like that, I wouldn't become an active listener to metal in other forms until probably I hit university. So that would have been around 90. And at that time, actually, I owe it to Don. Actually, Don started lending me his mixtapes. And thanks to Don's hate tapes, as he used to call them.
That was a dope term.
That was a dope term, okay.
Yeah, because it was music everybody else hated.
Right, okay, there we go. So thanks to Don's hate mixtapes, I got into Judas Priest. And they would probably be my first love as far as metal goes. So it goes back to Judas Priest again.
What was it about that band that grabbed your attention, gentlemen? Like, what was it about Priest over some of the other older hard rock bands, you know, whether it be Deep Purple or Zeppelin or, you know, somebody like that really turned you around and said to you, introduced you to a new music or music done in a new way?
That's an interesting question. I guess for me, it came at the right time for me. Like I said, I was in university. I was exploring different kinds of music. And Judas Priest itself had a good, like, hard driving rhythm to it that I really appreciated. You know, songs like Breaking the Law, for example, or that. Kind of, not that I was going out to, you know, break the law or anything like that, but it's kind of, but, you know, the rhythm and the lyrics and that kind of just spoke to me at that time. You know, there was this rebellious aspect to Judas Priest. Also, I found Judas Priest songs to be the kind of stuff that I liked from movie soundtracks, for example, which I was also into at the time. Not that there was a lot of Priest and music soundtracks, but that hard-driving action sound. Like it was almost like they were doing music to act as soundtracks to action movies and stuff that I liked. If I could have back in those days, because this was pre-internet, of course, you know, I probably would have been taking them and like using them to make like music videos on YouTube or something like that back in the day. I couldn't, so the only place that I had that was actually in my own head. So I would make little music videos in my head to go along with Judas Priest songs, because some of them just had such great lyrics, especially I was into like cyberpunk at that point, and you know, getting into some anime at that point, and it all kind of just meshed together. It worked very well for me. So that's kind of why I got into Priest. How about you, Don?
I think I ended up with Priest because, well, when I was a kid, up until I was around 10 or 11, the only music I listened to was the Beatles. I don't know why, just nothing else appealed to me. And then
right, we forgive you.
And then around that age, I started getting into some of the more psychedelic stuff from that era. So I got into the Moody Blues, Jethro Tull. Big fan of why can't I remember? Arthur Brown. And then the Judas Priest stuff, because they kind of came out of that tradition. A lot of the stuff that I heard, like I say, just prior to British Steel, like say Stained Class, or the one I can't remember just before that, still had a touch of that, but it had some weight behind it because they were starting to use those like heavy riffs, and they had the double guitars and the screaming vocals. And again, yeah, it was just that idea. It was music that had some punch to it.
Yeah, Painkiller came out before British Steel, I think.
Oh no, Painkillers did it?
Yeah.
Because that Painkiller is one of the later ones, just before they broke up.
Oh wait, no, I'm wrong. You're right. It should go what? Okay, fine. I'll go look it up.
Okay.
While we're talking here.
Well, so what was it about? Okay, the music obviously grabbed you, but I mean, there's another element to Judas Priest that can't be overlooked, and that is the style that they came to basically define, and especially for the heavy metal of the 1980s. Was that something that was appealing to you as well as the music? I mean, when you would pick up an album cover, whether it be British Steel or Painkiller, the guys would be decked out in a uniform that was all their own.
It was. To me, I took the music as it was. I was mostly getting it through like secondhand, and I bought a few CDs or tapes back in the day too, but I never saw them live. So to me, their actual look never mattered. To me, it was purely the music. That's what I really got from them, and a little bit from the covers, I suppose. But their look for me never really wasn't part of it. Not for me anyway. By the way, it goes Rock and Roll in 74, Sad Winds of Destiny. in 76,
Yep.
Sin After Sin in 77.
That's when I couldn't
and
remember.
Stained Class in 78.
Isn't Point of Entry before that?
Point of Entry is 81.
Oh, okay.
After British Steel.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there we go. And Screaming for Vengeance, Defenders of the Faith, Turbo, Ram It Down, Painkiller, Jugulator, Demolition, and then, yeah, they did a couple more in the 2000s. Which I didn't really care much for. I actually really liked their 70s, 80s stuff is the stuff I really enjoyed.
The last couple that they did was Nostradamus and
Yes.
Angel of Retribution.
Yes.
I thought it was interesting. Halford came back, and they went back to like their 70s sound.
Oh, okay. I should give it a listen.
Like that sounds a lot like their earlier albums, like before they really caught on.
Don, were you as interested in their style? So the use of leather and chains and very much going for the motorcycle look. Was that something that was appealing to you, and just in terms of them being more outlandish than any other band that you had been listening to up to that point?
Well, again, it's hard to be more outlandish than Arthur Brown. He used to set
That's
himself
true.
on fire. So.
That's true. Yeah, you're right. You're right about that.
For me, it was mostly just the music. I do remember, because I had Doak and Towers, the two of my bestest friends ever, Rob knows them, that we started hanging out in high school, and they were big into all kinds of music, and that was where I got exposed to a lot of this stuff. I remember being at Towers's, and your early mid-'80s Judas Priest really stood out to me, because that was when hair metal was catching on, and like those guys aren't pretty like everybody else.
Well, why don't we talk about the reputation that heavy metal has, or had, and perhaps still has today? Is that something that you embraced back in the day when you discovered Judas Priest, and is that something you still embrace today? The reputation that metal had back in the early 80s and up to the present.
Well, oh yeah, because I remember the PMRC hearings and seeing Dee Schneider sticking up and listening to that and thinking, that guy is exactly right. And that was kind of the thing that started making me more curious about some of that sort of thing.
So Don, let's just talk about Black Sabbath a little bit, because you mentioned that Judas Priest was one of your first entry points into heavy metal. Talk to me about when you discovered Judas Priest, how you discovered them, and what kind of an impact they had on you.
When I started listening to different things, like I lucked out and I come from a family that takes their music very seriously as fans. Like a lot of them play, but not professionally. And I remember when I was looking for new stuff, I was just going through my mother's record collection. And that was where I found all of this. And at one point she had picked up some Judas Priest, and I remember listening to it and thinking that, yeah, it was similar to the stuff that I already liked, but it had a little bit more bite to it.
Okay, but Sabbath, where did they enter? Where did they enter into your musical discoveries?
I got into them a little, oddly enough, a little later on. And that was my Aunt Kitty was another one, takes her music seriously, and she was big into like the psychedelic rock, the acid rock, the heavier stuff from like the 70s and that. And going through her records, I found a lot of Black Sabbath. And again, I think it appealed to me because they would sing about these weird, heavy topics, and their songs were stories. And that appealed to me because it gave them a little more substance than, say, the kind of pop music you usually hear on the radio.
But do you not? What was it? Was the music then similar in sound then to what you had been exposed to from Judas Priest, or so? Did you see Black Sabbath as continuing a legacy that had been started with Judas Priest, or were you aware that they were pioneers that Judas Priest had been influenced by and inspired by.
Well, I think I came in, like I say, I came into it backwards, and I think the thing that struck me about Black Sabbath, this will probably sound weird, is they sound like the evil alternate universe version of the Moody Blues.
Okay, how so?
I think it's because they came from a similar musical tradition, and they had a lot of the same, I guess, underlying structure to the sounds, but because they played everything odd, and I seem to recall that was because of an accident.
Okay.
That Tony Iommi...
What did you think was odd about them, Don?
Because it's the I'm trying to think of because I'm not a music guy. I don't know the technical terms for anything. But when you listen to them, they had that psychedelic sound, but it almost sounds like they're playing it backwards.
Okay, that's understandable. Yeah.
Because they're using that jerky note progression kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, there's on Paranoid, there's tracks like Fairies Wear Boots, which are about, the downside to drug taking. So, that song is very psychedelic in nature, very woozy. And Sabbath was absolutely coming out of the psychedelic era and very much influenced by the Beatles, by the Jefferson Airplane, by the whole psychedelic movement that emerged in the mid to late 60s. So that's a fair point, Don. That for you to feel, do you feel that the music was slightly, like as you say, an odder version of the Moody Blues?
Yeah, and they did the thing what I like, because I've mentioned it on a couple of shows kind of in passing, but where I live here in Windsor, it's what you'd get if cyberpunk happened in the 1970s. So we've always had this kind of like dark, dingy kind of side to things. And as a kid, I kind of grew up aware of that. And when you listen to something like Sabbath, they were willing to bring that in. And I thought of that because when you think of a song like, say, Fairies Wear Boots, and they're talking about the downside of the go-go rock and roll lifestyle, and you had bands who were talking about the upside, or you get a song like War Pigs, which is the same themes. Like, in the day, everybody's like, peace and love, man. But there's this other side to that whole thing. Like, you can say that war is bad, we shouldn't do it, but they were more willing to go into the darker places to make their point, and that kind of felt more genuine to me.
Well, it's interesting you make the reference, Don, to Windsor being very much like a cyberpunk landscape. I mean, Black Sabbath were a working class band. They were working class guys who basically escaped from a potential bleak working class existence. Birmingham is a former industrial city, so sort of like Hamilton, Ontario used to be. So, and it's in the middle of nowhere. It's very, and it's known as a really, really tough town. So if the music sounds tough, if the lyrics sound dark and depressing, I'm not saying that geography and music have any kind of literal connection to it. They would say our music did reflect where we came from, where we came from, and I think it's either Geezer Butler or Bill Ward has called their music not heavy metal but downer music. Like openly called it like downer music. It's not. It's we have there's a new genre like doom metal, but they never saw themselves as heavy metal. It was more as they said downer rock, because it was depressing. And then of course the name was guaranteed to offend.
Yeah.
And the opening, again, as I said, taking the cues from from the Hammer movies and Dennis Wheatley novels and the Wicker Man and so on. And and Geezer Butler acknowledges that, like he was a big fan of Dennis Wheatley novels, and they were all big fans of the Hammer movies. So.
Well, that's what was popular in England when they were growing up, right? And even when they were in the 60s and 70s. Hammer was like the thing. It was a little bit counterculture. It was a little bit naughty in a way.
Yep.
And it was also something that appealed to the new young generation of the time.
Absolutely. So, Rob, when did you discover Black Sabbath, and what kind of an impact did it have on you? And...
Oh boy. That would be tricky. Again, I probably discovered Sabbath really as a band through Don's tape collection. Don's tape collection introduced me to a lot of music. That was one of the things I got out of our friendship when we first met back in the day. I've never, in all honesty, been a big Black Sabbath fan. I know. Sorry, guys. It's an actual truth. I mean, I appreciate some of their stuff, like War Pigs, for example. I've often, that's a great song. War Pigs is a great song. The original Iron Man song. What else? What other great? I'm trying to think of what else But Sabbath themselves, to me, are not didn't have that appeal, and I think that's part of that is because I, unlike Don, come from London, Ontario, which is a middle class white bread town. So while Don may compare Windsor to cyberpunk Detroit Night City there, London is more along the lines of a what would be a better way to describe it? Here, okay, I'll use I'll use the proper terms. Windsor is closer to Gotham City, but London is more like Metropolis, where it's more like things are brighter. Everyone's like has their little white picket fences. Everything's kind of more happy here. I mean, London's not a perfect place by any means, but it's a slightly more affluent, more middle class town or city, because it is a city. Mm-hmm. And so as an end result, for me, the music has a different resonance. And that's probably why the stuff by Black Sabbath didn't really appeal to me. And even some of Judas Priest, when we're talking about their stuff that's a little more, shall we say, a little more dirty, a little more gritty, that's not the stuff that I fell in love with out of Priest. The Priest stuff I tend to fall in love with was, like I said, stuff that I thought would make a good soundtrack for action movies and such at the time. And so it's part of the difference of perspectives, I guess, that between Don and I. So that's why, Sabbath is not my metal band of choice. They're not bad. I'm not saying anything bad about them at all. But Sabbath is not the one that I would is not my go-to metal band. Let's put it that way.
Well, that's fair enough. That's fair enough.
If you want to go to a metal band, for me anyway, we should talk about the one that hasn't been introduced yet, but maybe we were saving the best for last. Okay. And that, of course, would be Iron Maiden.
Uh-oh.
Okay, so let's talk about a little bit Iron Maiden. Now, should we do a little bit of background in terms of where they fit in the timeline of heavy metal?
We might as well. So where does Iron Maiden pop up, Richard?
Okay, Iron Maiden, first of all, you can't talk about Iron Maiden until you start talking about a band that we were probably going to get to, but we should talk about before we get to Iron Maiden, go ahead. Which is Motorhead.
Okay.
Okay.
So Motorhead are the band that act as a perfect transition group between Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. So Judas Priest were around before Motorhead, and we're still going when Judas Priest became popular, and of course when Iron Maiden took off. And Motorhead are really important because they are the band that brought the punks and the metalers together. So so we first of all, we got to remember that Motorhead started in 1975, and for many people they were a punk band. For some people they were a metal band. I remember going when I was a punk. I had lots of friends who hated heavy metal, but loved Motorhead. So Motorhead, fast, loud, stripped down, economical, hard driving, power trio music. So indebted as much to The Who, indebted as much to Cream, but the tempo is been cranked up exponentially, influenced by the Sex Pistols, by the Clash, by the emerging punk scene. You got to remember, Motorhead starts in '75. Punk in the UK starts in '76. Punk in America, television and Dead Boys is 74, 75. So, Motorhead, again, their focus on speed, their focus on economy, and their focus on keeping the music short, sharp, and shock. Take a cue from Pink Floyd. You cut out all the needless guitar solos. You cut out all the needless drum solos. You just, as you're saying, Rob, make it high energy, high impact music. That's where Iron Maiden comes from. So Iron Maiden takes the storytelling and the folk elements that you associate with Black Sabbath. So Black Sabbath being kind of electric folk musicians telling stories that go back to Poe, go back to Dennis Wheatley, go back to Algeron Blackwood, go back to Mary Shelley, go back to Bram Stoker, but are also Iron Maiden is also influenced by British history, the lore and legacy of British history. So you take the sound of Motorhead, take the lyric and storytelling of progressive rock, because Steve Harris was a huge prog rock fan, and take the power and guitar playing of Zeppelin and Deep Purple, and you've got Iron Maiden. And the other thing about Iron Maiden is they wrote, the important thing is, and this is where they deviate from Black Sabbath, this is where they deviate from Motorhead, but they share a connection to Judas Priest, catchable, hummable pop hooks. Big, fat choruses. So when you hear Run to the Hills, you can sing that at the top of your lungs. You sing Living After Midnight, Breaking the Law. The choruses are built in. And now Iron Maiden were, of course, a part of what was called then the new wave of British heavy metal. So bands like Saxon and Def Leppard. And of course, Judas Priest rode those coattails. And Motorhead was included in that, but Motorhead were outside of that. Motorhead, I always thought were closer to hard rock and then to hardcore punk. That's the other thing to think about with Motorhead. They became one of the key bands allied with the hardcore punk movement from which you get thrash metal too. So hardcore punk and so punk rock and hardcore punk sort of merged after the new wave of British heavy metal with bands like Metallica and Slayer, who were big fans of punk, post-punk, and as well as some of the old school bands. So but let me first of all, before we go to Iron Maiden, Rob and Don, were you Motorhead fans?
No.
Okay, that's one of the shortest answers you've given on any question I've ever asked you, Rob.
No, yeah, exactly. And we've known each other a while, Richard. But the answer is just no. I've never been a Motorhead fan. I think I've heard a few of their songs, but it just never caught with me. I literally know almost nothing about Motorhead. I know the absolute minimum you can get away with knowing and still like metal, basically. And it's because they just never, maybe at some point I'll give them a second chance and maybe they'll catch. But so far in my life, no, Motorhead's not been my thing. How about you, Don?
I kind of discovered them again, like, later on, like, past when their inception. And I never minded. I can't say I'm a big fan, but I don't mind them. Like, they're good driving music, depending on how you drive.
I could see that. So sorry, Richard. The answer is no.
Okay, no, that's fine. So let's go to.
Well, hold on. Let's turn this around for a second. So, Richard, are you a big Motorhead fan?
Oh, massive Motorhead fan.
Okay, there we go. Okay, why?
Massive
Why are you a massive Motorhead fan?
Let me answer your Motorhead question with answering my Black Sabbath question. So, because I think those two are tied intrinsically. So, I grew up as a hard rock fan. So I grew up as a prog rock and hard rock fan. So I had 3 Led Zeppelin t-shirts before the age of 13. So, I mean, Zeppelin were, when I was 10, 11, 12, Led Zeppelin were my band. I grew up with prog rock, Genesis, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, King Crimson, and Yes. So between about the ages of about 12 and about 15. So prog rock and hard rock were my music. Now, the interesting thing about Black Sabbath is, and this is a point that tends to upset a lot of people. Black Sabbath were the loser band of the early 1970s. So when you were growing up in the 1970s, the one band that all the cool people agreed on was a loser band were Black Sabbath. So when I was in high school, and I was in middle school, and then I was in high school, all the real losers and listened to Black Sabbath. Now, I pointed this out to my students, all my metal students, who get really deeply upset, and then I tell them, go and look it up. Like, go and look it up, and they come back and they say, okay, sir, you're actually right. So the stigma, there was always a stigma attached to Black Sabbath. First of all, the music wasn't as complex. It was very rudimentary. The subject matter, people were like, okay, really? Like, you're singing about Satan, you're singing about children of the grave, really? And so there was a lack of sophistication in their music if you were a prog rock fan, and they weren't as heavy and as technically as proficient as a band like Zeppelin. So I inadvertently found out about Black Sabbath basically by hanging out with people who were not cool, and I realized that this was a music that I was missing. So I probably didn't get into Black Sabbath until I was probably about 15, 16, just almost just before I discovered punk. And then I got really into Black Sabbath actually through hardcore punk, Chicago, Los Angeles hardcore punk. So a lot of the in the mid 80s, a lot of the hardcore punk and indie rock bands were really getting into Black Sabbath, like mid-period Black Flag albums, or very Black Sabbath like. And so I was like, maybe I missed the boat, like back in the day, and I went back and started listening to them seriously. And then one of the other things they did in the mid 80s, one of the real ways of turning people off, period, whether they were, if they were listening to REM, who I'm a big fan of, I was a big fan of at the time. You would put on a Sabbath album, you could clear the room. You go, Black Sabbath. Oh no, what's this person like? And Motorhead the same way. Motorhead were loud, they were dirty, they were smelly. The first time I saw them was at the Coliseum at the CNE, just after the Royal Winter Fair. The concerts on YouTube, and they were loud as heck, and it smelled like crazy. The last time I saw them was 2000, and I'm going to get this wrong. Was it 2013 or 2012, 2013 at Downsview Park, heavy Toronto? It had rained for 48 hours straight. They had not put any straw on. My work boots, my hiking boots were clogged with mud. I mean, we were, my son and I were in this morass of mud, and there was no place to sit except these little islands of grass. And it started to rain, and Motorhead came on, and it was just a glorious convergence of rain and mud and Lemmy. And I thought, like this was like 20 years after the first time I saw them, and I thought, what else could you like? It was dirty, smelly, music, and the weather was dirty, and it was messy and miserable. I thought, and it, just these convergence of factors. Now, what I would say to that is, Iron Maiden are euphoric. They're aspirational.
They are, absolutely. That's why I love them.
Iron Maiden, Motorhead, you want to be in a dang dark place. It's whereas Iron Maiden, the first time I saw Iron Maiden was in front of 100,000 people, all singing at the same time, and I was just like, where else could they be? Like they were not a, I never associated Iron Maiden with being a club band. So
they belong in front of a huge crowd. That's where they belong. Yeah, it's the most natural thing in the world.
Yeah. So talk to me about your love of Iron Maiden. Talk to me about the music, the storytelling, and the imagery.
Well, I think I can cover it pretty simply. I mean, you've already said about how they're a euphoric band, and I guess also they're a very smart band. Like, I mean, they're smart storytellers, and that's something that I appreciate. I mean, let's look, just to give an example, since our listeners may or may not be familiar with them, let's look at it as simple, one of their albums, Power Slave, since it's one of my favorites. Why not look at Power Slave for a moment? So, let's do a quick rundown here. Okay, so we've got the first song, Aces High. What is it? It's a song about what it's like to be in the Battle of Britain as a Spitfire pilot. It's written from the Spitfire pilot's point of view. There we go. The second song, 2 Minutes to Midnight, is about the threat of nuclear war that they were under. This album came out in 84, when the Cold War was still going on. And so they're talking about the threat of nuclear war and the situation and what could happen and what might happen. Next, we've got Flash of the Blade, which, if I remember right, Flash of the Blade is the one about... is that the one... No, Miyamoto Musashi's Sun and Steel.
Yeah.
What's Flash of the Blade about, Don? You should know. Crap.
Oh, I forget, because I think it's another, like...
They're story songs about duelists, and the one that come after it is The Duelists, which is about two medieval guys dueling with each other. But Flash of the Blade is, I think it's one about... Oh my god, I'm going to lose my Iron Maiden credibility here. You look that up. Okay, I'll keep going. So then we've got Back in the Village, which is, of course, about the classic TV series The Prisoner.
Yeah.
And which is talking about, someone ending up in the village, actually, it's a song about freedom, basically, about someone being involved with a bad relationship and where they're going back in again. But again, it's a story song. We've got Power Slave, which is an amazing song about a Egyptian pharaoh who literally discovers that, oh, by the way, even though we've called you a god your whole life, you're not really immortal. You're just another guy. and his realization of that as he's dying, and it's told from a first person point of view. Is there any other form of music, like literally out there, where you're going to get that?
Yeah.
I mean, really, is there, or these songs put together on a single album, and they finish off with their version of "Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner," for God's sake, which is very long, at almost 14 minutes long, but and you don't get more literary than that. Yeah. I mean, Power Slave's a good example, and most of their albums, at least of that period, are like that. They're based in history, they're based in storytelling, they're based in imagination and mythology. There's some science fiction elements sometimes to them, or fantasy elements to them, and they are glorious. There's no other way to describe it, and they're just incredibly catchy and fun to listen to as well. So, I mean, they are, without a doubt, my favorite metal band exactly because of that.
What about you, Don?
Oh, I kind of agree, because my thing, when it comes to the entertainment I seek out, I always look for things that give me what my normal life doesn't. So I like depth and complexity and surprise and meaning and intellect and flavor and texture, because that's everything I don't get in life.
And I know that's hard to respond to. How does Iron Maiden fulfill that for you?
Well, it's like Rob says, because you've got these stories, and they've got one of the things I like about Maiden, and for myself, probably my preferred type of music in general would be what comes kind of later from the Iron Maiden tradition, would be like your power metal or your symphonic metal. And it's those build-ups. Like a Maiden song, it builds to something. It starts slow, it drags you in, and then just like all hell breaks loose with the lyrics and the music, and it takes you somewhere. And when you get to the end, there's like a feeling, like the story's done, and there's a conclusion, good or bad, because they don't always end well.
So do you appreciate? Well, first of all, one of the things to talk about when it comes to Iron Maiden is the fact that they write melodic, catchy songs. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could play those songs on an acoustic guitar or on a piano, and you would still be able to have interpretations that would be recognizable, unlike.
And U2 is filled with them, by the way.
Okay. I wasn't aware. So is your love of Iron Maiden tied to the fact that it is much? There is a symphonic, anthemic element that comes that is a part and parcel of their sound.
I think that's part of it, but it's not just that they've got like the catch, the hook, the meter. It's that they can have that with all the other things that are going on in the song musically. That true. Musically, their stuff is very complex, but it doesn't sound that way because it's all tied in together and it's all kind of moving in the same direction.
Well, the interesting thing about that doesn't get mentioned about a lot about Iron Maiden is that their two of their favorite bands are, one is of course Thin Lizzy, and the other is a band called Wishbone Ash. Now, Wishbone Ash and Thin Lizzy are important because they were the two bands that pioneered the twin lead attack that, of course, Judas Priest based their sound around. And, of course, the sound of Iron Maiden is based around that twin lead guitar attack, or in the case now with three lead guitar attack. Now, of course, there were bands. Now, in the UK, Wishbone Ash and Thin Lizzy were, of course, developed that twin lead guitar attack. And, of course, that in America, bands like the Allman Brothers and Leonard Skinner, the Outlaws, were doing that in country rock. So, that they're a band that's symphonic, they're a band that has got prog rock elements, band that's got folk elements to it, and a band is much influenced by Motorhead, as they are by Sabbath, as they are by by Yes or by 19th century romantic literature.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Oh, hell
I mean,
yeah.
they've got it all. They really do. And
Yeah.
so that's one of the reasons why I love Iron Maiden stuff.
So let me add in a little bit of discordance into the
Okay, go.
into the podcast. Now, at around that same time, Rob, there was a group of bands that sometimes Iron Maiden got lumped in with, and sometimes they didn't, and those were the glam metal bands of the
Right.
1980s. So the Poisons, the Motley Crues, the Bon Jovis. Now they get lumped in as heavy metal bands, whether you like it or not. Where do they fit in on your musical timeline?
Well, to answer your question, I mean, I actually came to them later. Like, of course, as a child of the 80s, I was very aware of Bon Jovi. I would hear Bon Jovi and Poison and Motley Crue. I would hear them on the radio. Like, I listened to mostly Top 40 radio, and they made the Top 40. And so as an end result, I heard them, but I always considered them more of hard rock. Like, I never viewed them as metal bands. I mean, I did listen to them a bit, on the radio when I was a high school student, but they weren't something that I sought out or anything like that. But I enjoyed them. I mean, I was a big Bon Jovi fan for a while there. But again, that would come after I got into metal and such, not before. I wasn't a big music guy when I was in high school, really. Unlike Don.
Don, did you have an affection for those glam metal bands, or did you react against them?
It's interesting you mention that, because I can remember, like, up until like the mid '80s, that's what people thought heavy metal was. Mm-hmm. Like
exactly.
that, and at the time too, Judas Priest. At that point, a lot of people were considering them hard rock, which is why sometimes I think it's best not to get wrapped around the axle with the lexicons. But I wasn't a big hair metal guy. I gotta say, I do kind of like Motley Crue. Mm-hmm. But it's because the themes in that, for a lot of the songs they wrote, they weren't just party rock. They wrote some of these like weird little stories, and they had a lot of songs about like weird characters. And a lot of that appealed to me because, again, it fit in with other stuff that I enjoyed.
Okay. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. We all know that from physics. So were you then fans of the subgenre that reacted against glam metal, the thrash metal of bands like Slayer or Metallica?
For myself, I was never a Slayer fan. I did like Metallica, though. Metallica did some good stuff, but I'm afraid, I'm mostly just familiar with their, like, Enter Sandman and such, their most famous stuff. Which, again, they're more melodic stuff I tended to like, but not the stuff that was more discordant. You've never
been a shredder?
No. I never got into thrash metal, never got in. My line is entirely melodic metal.
Okay.
That's entirely where I am as far as metal goes. So death metal, things like that, never appealed to me.
Okay.
Never has, probably never
Don?
will.
When you get to like the thrash guys, that's another one of the genres I kind of pick and choose who I like. Like Metallica wasn't bad. When we were in high school, our cruising song was "I'm the Man" by Anthrax.
Yeah, Anthrax is okay.
And they're one of the ones that they kind of start thrash and then they go sort of other places. But there was a few from that era that I didn't think was too bad.
Because it's interesting that was a time when thrash metal was they were the that was very much underground music. I mean, they were mixing hardcore punk with at one point it was called speed metal, then it became thrash metal. It's people forget that bands like Metallica and Exodus and Slayer and Megadeth were very much on part of the underground music community.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to say they were indie rock, but there was, it wasn't until '86 with, Master of Puppets went top 40, and then, Justice for All went number 6 on the charts, and then Anthrax and Megadeth that same year had hits, and and only Slayer has been the one band that has not, I don't think crossed over into the Billboard charts as in a way that those other bands have.
That's true. When you think about it, yeah.
That's true.
So death metal, black metal, and none of the other extreme versions. These Scandinavian metal bands from Sweden or Norway. None of those bands have ever, or even from Florida, have never had any. And the bands from. Well, remember the whole death metal comes from Florida. It comes from bands like Death and Deicide and Obituary. Those bands that share more of a lyrical association with Black Sabbath, but integrating slasher movie violence as opposed to hammer movie violence.
Right. Yeah.
Those never had any appeal for you two?
Not really, no. Yeah. I mean, it just part of the problem is that those forms of metal also came kind of after my, like you say, my intro to metal period, when I was into it in the 90s. So a lot of that stuff, I know that some of that stuff is 90s stuff, but I was getting into the 80s stuff during the 90s. I'm a little late that way. And so by the time I would have gotten around to them, I wasn't really listening to as much metal or music at that point, I guess you could say. My interest had gone in other directions. So as an end result, I didn't really, I never got into to that stuff. Plus, as I said, my interest in metal is almost entirely melodic. Like, I would rather listen to stuff like, who else? Nightwish, for example, or Blind Guardian, even Manowar, for example. There's stuff that tends to be more on the melodic side. And I guess it's because I do appreciate the complexity of the rhythms and everything as well.
Rob, what is the appeal for you of the symphonic European metal bands like Blind Guardian, like Nightwish, and like Opeth? What is it about their style of music? Well, I think for most
of them, they're still following the line, I guess, of Iron Maiden. I mean, they come out of Iron. For me anyway, they may not literally in lineage terms come out of Iron Maiden, but they have that in common, right? They're still storytelling bands. A Nightwish song is as much a story as any Iron Maiden song is. The same with like Blind Guardian. Blind Guardian are also Blind Guardian's another good example to what I was talking about earlier. They're a whole metal band that basically exists pretty much to just produce stuff that's right out of fantasy novels. I mean, every one of their songs is pretty much about magic or wizards or warriors or something like that. Nightwish does a little bit of that too. So going right back into it, to the whole nerdy aspect, they are types of they are bands that are definitely involved with the more geeky, nerdy culture in a lot of ways, and they're drawing from that. And so even their lyrics and their ideas in that are stuff that resonate more with me because they're connected to stuff I'm interested in. Just to continue that on, even Manowar, which is a slightly different style, but is still very melodic, and is basically, if Conan the Barbarian had had his own metal band, it would be Manowar.
Yeah.
That's literally the only way to describe him.
Yeah, I gotta kind of agree with Rob. One of the things that I do whenever I write stuff is I like to find theme songs for the characters, because it's another way to think through. And I find a lot of the stuff that I write, the theme songs that seem to fit the characters, come from that tradition. They come more from like the European power metal kind of thing.
What specific themes and why did this music spark these specific?
Well, I think it's the idea that almost all of the songs are a story. They're like little mini operas with like a beginning and end. A lot of them don't end well, I think. And again, that appeals to me because you don't see that in a lot of entertainment. You don't see a hero that's doomed and truly knows it, or a hero that has to fight a fight they can't win. And those are themes that come up a lot in like the power metal and the more symphonic metal, like the stories for the songs. And I think, like I say, I find that it's refreshing. It rings true. And if you've got a hero who knows they're doomed and goes into the fight anyway, like, to me, that's more heroic than most action movies where, okay, this guy's already kicked the ass of 50 guys. He can't think this other guy's going to be a challenge. And neither should the audience. So.
Definitely.
Don, you mentioned that the we've mentioned this a couple of times, the symphonic element that you find in bands like Blind Guardian or in a band like Opeth,
Nightwish,
or Nightwish, Nightwish, and that's an element that clearly separates many of the American bands or North American bands from the European bands, is the influence of classical music, and we all know of many of the European band members studied
classical music,
classical music, and went through conservatory or played in orchestras and groups in grade school and a high school, which makes their music a lot more melodic. Is that important to you, that there is a technical virtuosity to the music that comes via them being influenced by European classical composers like Bach or Vivaldi, or which can be found in their guitar playing or in their
I don't think for me it's exactly that's something that's important, because I like a lot of like the down and dirty, stripped down kind of bands too. But I think, like I say, I like big. And if you're fielding an orchestra and you're getting them all working together, that just by its nature is going to be bigger. It's going to feel bigger. It's going to sound bigger. And like I say, I don't get that in life. Life for me is very small. So that I find oddly empowering kind of thing.
I can see that.
Well, it's funny about the influence of the European classical composers on a lot of those European symphonic metal bands. There's a video by that I showed in my History of Western Music course by I think they're from Norway or from Sweden, Children of Bodom, and they're doing, the two guitar players are doing Vivaldi's Water Music on twin lead guitars, and it's bang on. Like you can tell they didn't just practice the song so they could show it off. You could tell that they actually knew how to play that piece of music. The other thing I was going to touch on, guys, is the tritone, which of course, we can tie that back to the monks of the Middle Ages who were deeply disturbed by that chord progression, or by that phrasing. Has there been the myth and lore attached to that, to the metal sound? Is that something that's always been
well, hold on a sec, Richard. Let's take a step back here. Some of our audience probably isn't familiar with what a tritone is, and they're not quite up on their music history. So why don't we explore that a tiny bit more? Okay. So can you explain in the simplest terms exactly what a tritone is and why that was a big deal?
Well, the tritone is an interval spanning three tones, such as C and F sharp, and it's a forbidden dissonance that was first developed in medieval ecclesiastical singing. So the monks called it Diabolus in music.
Why would they do that? Why would they call it the devil in music? What's wrong with these musical notes?
Well, because a lot of early medieval music was very consonant in nature. I mean, it may have been very drone based, but it was very harmonic in nature. So when you listen to the voices of a church choir, it is very smooth. It's very harmonic. It is very consonant in nature. It's it's an angelic sound. Well, the tritone is as a dissonant that is foreign and is outside of the consonants that we associate with natural progressions and harmonies and harmonic relationships. So, and it heavy metal also uses the pentatonic scale, the 5-note scale, and that has a dissonant sound to it. So a lot of heavy metal music uses the tritone interval.
Okay. And they're doing that on purpose as a way to produce something that is dissonant, that is not, that causes a reaction from the audience.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and it's as much a part of the blues. I mean, a lot of blues, it doesn't necessarily use the tritone, but it does use the pentatonic scale. So the 12-bar blues comes out of the pentatonic scale, which is naturally more dissonant.
Right.
And
okay.
less consonant. So
can you give an example where our listeners could actually find a good example of this tritone sound?
The opening to Black Sabbath.
There we go. I figured you'd give me an example like that.
That first riff, that absolute first riff, is the sound of the tritone, and it's a riff that's been it's been borrowed heavily, and to be understated and to be polite. It's a imitation's a sincere form of flattery, and that is one of those progressions that is associated with heavy metal, and of course one of the great things about it is the myth and the lore associated with it ties in with heavy metal and its fundamental rebellion against Christianity, which is something I'd also like to talk about, because I think that also ties into the lore of heavy metal being sort of forbidden music. The one of the few musics that parents always hated. They may have liked folk, they may have liked rock, they may have liked country rock, but it's one thing for your parents to like the Eagles. It's another thing for your parents.
Well, definitely.
To like
well,
Black
let's
Sabbath.
explore that. I mean, why not? All right. So, why is it that metal has been for a long time the music that your parents hated? Is that on purpose? Is that like by design? Is that something that was almost part of their marketing? Or why have they done this?
I think that I think a lot of these themes, especially for a lot of the hard rock bands, they borrowed or stole or appropriated their music and their subject matter from the blues. So one of the myths of the classic myths of the blues is Robert Johnson selling his soul to the devil at the crossroads in Clarksdale, Mississippi. Now, whether that's true or not, it doesn't really matter, but it adds to the supernatural connection between music and a forbidden power. So and I think Black Sabbath, just by virtue of their name, they had an offense, and they had an offensive name. They sang songs that dealt with subject matter that seemed to be rebelling against Christianity. So teenagers want music that has a subject matter that's going to be offensive to all concerned who may be older than they are, and it has a grittier, doomier, more psychedelic sound, and a subject matter that fits the music, and that's the appeal of heavy metal. Now, the irony of Black Sabbath, of course, is that their songs were not Satanist in any way. I mean, Geezer Butler says that these are actually cautionary, warning songs. He says they're not embracing an embrace of Satanism or of evil. He says actually they are cautionary tales to warn people of the nature of evil, of the nature and power of forces beyond our control. So they're labeling as a satanic band. Geezer was like, these people haven't listened to our lyrics. So the sound may have that the sound may have sounded, for lack of a better word, satanic. But the lyrics were hardly. Their lyrics were actually expressing.
Well, that's okay, valid point. Although I think some of that is still them trying to have it both ways, though.
How do you think? How so, Rob?
Well, I think that it's easy to go out on in all black, call yourself Black Sabbath, go out on stage and use every trick in the book to look as satanic as possible, and then turn around and to make sure that the kids think you're edgy and cool. And then turn around and suddenly say, "Oh no, but look at our lyrics. Seriously, they're just a cautionary tale. Oh no, we're not really satanic or anything like that." Just so that the parents don't throw them all in jail. I mean,
Ozzy just looked like that. That wasn't intentional.
Well, there's that. There's definitely that.
But I would disagree, Rob, because I would say that they were. You got to remember, they were a band that had no plans at all. I mean, the success of Black Sabbath was an accident that none of them ever thought would happen. Whereas if you could say a band like King Diamond that deals with subject matter from horror movies or Cannibal Corpse, but are clearly influenced by slasher and gore, or Slayer, which are influenced by slasher and horror movies. They have lyrics that are guaranteed to offend, guaranteed to upset, and so you can understand that why the PMRC, when they found many rock lyrics to be offensive, dealing with subject matter that they found to be indecent, would easily find bands like Slayer or Judas Priest or to be breaching good taste and common decency. Whereas I think Sabbath were an underground band that became a success. I mean, that album was recorded.
Yeah, it wasn't very long.
Recorded in less than a week. Was it? They basically went in and found an engineer in their hometown of Birmingham. Went in and recorded this record, and then suddenly it was top 5. It was like, how the heck that happened? So, and I think there's also Geezer Butler's always again talked about his love of Hammer movies, of Dennis Wheatley novels and Algeron Blackwood and so on. So there is that. They do share a literary tradition with.
That's true.
With
true.
Iron Maiden, there's a bit of there's so they would say that those authors and those movies dealt with a darker side and more
well,
violent
yes, but
side
once
of
you
human
keep
nature.
in mind also the time they existed in. I mean, they were super edgy for their day. I mean, you can't, we look at them now and think, okay, well, it's, nice melodic, heavy metal, hard rock or that. But there was a time, especially in the 70s and the early 80s, especially when the whole satanic panic was going on and everything, when they looked at this music and they really did take it very seriously, especially, especially in Middle America and such. They took the whole Satanism thing very, very seriously. And maybe it wasn't planned, as you said, but they did really sink in with what was going on at the time. And there's no question they were exploring the darker side of things.
See, I think...
And... No, go, sorry.
I was going to say, I think you can split the difference, though, because I don't think the idea to outright offend was, like, Sabbath's original intent. But I had heard from... there was an interview with another band from that era that's one of my favorites, and that was the Blue Oyster Cult. And they were talking to those guys, and they said that where their subject matter and their songs and their sound came from, which I'm betting is the same with Sabbath and a bunch of other groups from that time, was that you were coming out of the 60s, coming into the 70s, there was all this like folk, happy, peace and love crap, and they were just sick of it. They wanted something different, so they wanted the anger and the hate, and they wanted the darker ideas, and they wanted to get more of that, because they were just filled up to the gills with the huggy stuff.
Well, I think that's actually a good point, because you can tie in that Black Sabbath, that album was recorded just after the Charles Manson murders. So and Altamont had just happened, where somebody was killed at the Rolling Stone concert at the Altamont Speedway north of San Francisco. Charles Manson had just killed Sharon Tate, and he and his murderous gang had gone on a rampage. So there is an atmosphere at the Chicago Democratic Convention in '68. The Vietnam War is getting uglier by the moment. So you could argue, Don, that Black Sabbath were definitely reflecting the mood. Of
they were a product of their era. That's true. That I believe.
So, to you two, does metal still have the same impact for you that it had the first time you discovered Judas Priest?
Yes and no. I mean, I don't listen to it as much as I did, back when I first discovered it and such, back in my, college days. But I think some of that's, though, because I still appreciate it just as much. I don't get quite the same charge out of it, but of course some of that's the whole neurochemistry, where if I remember right, music has a stronger effect on you when you're younger because of the way your neurochemistry is set up. And dopamine, there we go. And so as an end result, you get a stronger reaction out of it when you're younger because you have more dopamine in your system. And as you get older, you get less out of it. That said, if I'm working out, for example, or going for a run or something like that, I have metal on. There's no question about that. I mean, it is the most natural workout music in the world. It just drives you and forces you forward, especially stuff, again, symphonic metal and such. At least that's my take anyway. So, yes, to me, metal at this point is mostly just workout music, or occasionally I'll listen to it on the radio or something.
Oh, no, because I love all music in general, and we luck out here in Windsor because we have one of the last decent music stores on earth, and they're always getting strange new stuff, and I'm always digging through looking for strange new stuff. And yeah, I always gotta Gotta have my headphones on, my little music player thingy. And yeah, I still get as big a kick out of it, because I find there's always... metal gets ragged on for having so many subgenres, but I find that makes it exciting because there's so many people doing so many different things with it.
So who are your current favorites?
My current favorites?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be an interesting mix. I like Within Temptation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw them last year at Heavy Montreal. They were great.
Yeah, I like Hatebreed.
Oh, my son. Yeah, my son. That's one of my son's favorite bands. Hatebreed. Oh, in fact, my son listens to... Do you listen to Jasta's podcast?
No, I didn't know there was one.
Yeah, Jasta, who's the lead singer from Hatebreed, has probably one of the best metal podcasts. And he's interviewed everybody. And in fact, last August, when we were at Heavy Montreal... he was just about to go and do a podcast because my son got to meet Randy Blythe from Lamb of God and Jasta, and I know Jasta was going to do some podcasts at Heavy Montreal because of all the bands there. Yeah, apparently, and he gets. I'd have to talk to him. You'd have to talk to my son, but he gets everybody, and they talk at length. So Hatebreed, yes.
Wow. Because that's one of the nice things too I find with most of the subgenres, the guys will interact.
Yeah, actually, that's one of the interesting things. I'm off to Heavy Montreal at the beginning of August again, and I find heavy metal festivals to be very relaxed, very chilled. Everybody is there to enjoy the music. Everybody's polite. Everybody's courteous. So the stereotypical image of the heavy metaler doesn't exist, at least at the festivals that I've been to. And I've been to Mayhem in Phoenix. Wow. I've been to Wacken in Germany, and everybody is very polite, very courteous. So the stereotypical image of some drunken hellion. Sure, there are lots of drunken hellion at metal concerts, but there are lots of drunken hellions at any kind of musical genre. I don't think the genre. Yeah, I think alcohol. Where there's alcohol, you're gonna have drunken hellions, regardless of the musical genre.
But do you think that's because do you think a lot of metal fans are older, or like what's the age mix of these concerts you're going to, these like shows?
18 to 60.
Wow.
Okay, yeah.
If you go to Rob, if you go to Heavy Montreal, there is a wide audience. So you have those of us who have white hair, and then there are those who don't have white hair.
I don't have any hair.
Okay, but there are good. And then Don, there are those of you who don't have any hair. I mean, we find the regardless of the bands, we find the experience to be really relaxed, really chilled, as opposed to some other music festivals that I've been to that I won't talk about.
Well, you know what I think that is, though? When you compare metal to other genres of music, metal tends to be inclusive.
Very much so.
That's true.
Like, and that's in the theme. Like, if you listen to, say, pop music, or I know, like, the last crop of rappers and that, it's all, I'm the best, I'm awesome, dig me. Whereas metal tends to be more we, it tends to be more us. It tends to talk about, say, some character that's removed from the singer and the audience, but there's something that we can empathize with.
It's true. It's true. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Most metal bands are all about their fans, and they're really emphatic about that, about how important their fans are to them, and they try to be very connective. And yeah, I think that's one of the appeals. They're not just singing about what's in it for them, exactly as Don says.
Yeah, I think, Don, one of the reasons why I like metal now, I like all forms of metal. So I like the symphonic stuff. I like the extreme stuff. I like the old stuff. I like the new stuff. I find metal also has inadvertent connections to other forms of music. So there are a lot of for instance, a lot of extreme metal fans also love improv jazz. So if you know the music of John Zorn had a group called Naked City, and John Zorn, free jazz composer, improviser extraordinaire, had a group called Naked City that was film music done by crack jazz musicians. So albums like the first Naked City album, like was it 32 songs in 45 minutes. So but I mean, John Zorn's favorite composer is Carl Stallings. So if you think of what would Carl Stallings would do if he was making extreme hardcore jazz and death metal, and you have Naked City. Well, a lot of that sounds like extreme metal and extreme improv jazz, and there's been a lot of crossover between free jazz and metal. So a lot of and the same thing with genres like drones, so experimental minimalist drone music. Well, you got a band like Sun, who are like doom metal, so one note every 20 minutes. So slowing Sabbath down to this drone-y atmosphere, and a lot of people who would never listen to metal, who come from more experimental music, love Sun, or bands like Sun or Trouble or Earth or Boris. So it's interesting the way that metal, as it begins to splinter into subgenres and then subgenres, that it seems to find connections with people who are outside what you would call the traditional metal world.
Yeah. And I don't think other music does that. A couple good examples of that. There's a couple dudes on the YouTube that I follow. One goes by the name of 331 E-Rock, and one is Frog Leap Studios, and they do metal versions of other songs. And if you ever wanted to hear what ABBA would sound like as a thrash metal band, you go to Frog Leap Studios and you'd be amazed, because it's like, that actually sounds really good.
Yes, it does. I know what you mean.
And you don't see other genres. Like, it's tough to do something like that with, say, rap or country. Like, it doesn't quite work the same.
Do you think metal will always retain its outsider stance? Do you think it will always be music for outsiders, regardless of its flirtations with popularity and flirtations with the Billboard charts?
You know what? I think, thinking, because I've heard people's answer to that question a lot, but I think in a lot of ways metal is the most subversive kind of music, because what you get is you've always got like your core main genres, which I think nowadays are mainstream, but then they sort of branch off. And there's always going to be some genre of metal on the outside, but it's still going to maintain at least a thread to the old school guys on the inside. So in that way, you've got it you get both sides of the fence kind of thing.
Rob?
I agree with Don. I mean, I think that metal is always going to be there. I mean, it's just simply in a lot of ways, I mean, metal is ultimately a more extreme, slightly less mainstream version of pop, in a way. I mean, that's kind of how I view it, if you want to take it that way. It's playing with themes and ideas and sounds that don't quite work for the normal popular music audience, but which are still something that a certain audience enjoys. So it will always be there, some version of it anyway. And I think that's probably also why metal actually also appeals, as has just been said, to an outsider audience. And I think that's partly why it connects up again with the whole nerdly arts, is because many of the people who love the nerdly arts of one form or another, be they comics, movies, whatever, are also people who view themselves as outsiders. That's actually very common. As an end result, this is a form of music that speaks to them and touches them in some way.
Yeah, and I think you're right that way, Rob, because it's interesting the way that metal's popularity is now truly global.
Yeah.
I can't remember. Sam Dunn has that documentary, Global Metal, and he interviews bands from Iran, I think Egypt and Lebanon and Malaysia and India, and this music, the music they're making, is utterly subversive, and many of these musicians have been arrested and jailed and incarcerated for making a form of music that many people in the West laugh at and don't take it serious at all. So I think you're right. You're noting that it still has a subversive element. I think you're right.
Which it does. It absolutely is. Maybe not as much in the West now. I mean, it's kind of alt mainstream in a lot of ways. I mean, here, but yeah, in other countries, metal still serves that subversive role. And I think that's the appeal. That really is the appeal. I mean, for a lot of people, they want something that's different. They want something subversive, whether it's that young, youthful rebellion thing, or it's just because you want to be exposed to something that's not part of mainstream society. Which
all united with their one hand gesture of the metal horns.
Yep, that's true.
It's true. It's true. When when I've been at metal festivals, I may be speaking a different language than those people. When we were at Wacken, there were people from Holland, there were people from Poland, there were people from Germany. You give them the horns, and a big smile crosses their face, and then you move on. It's as Don or Robbie, you were saying, it's an inclusive music that is universal, and yet is in some respects still on the outside of the mainstream.
Exactly. Yeah, it's, I guess in some ways actually being a metal fan is both you're outside the mainstream, but it's also a safe place outside the mainstream, oddly enough. I know that sounds odd for many reasons, but the truth is, I'm sure people do occasionally get shot at metal concerts and things like that, but nowhere near as much as they do at like rap concerts or things, or those kind of performances.
I agree.
So being a metal fan, I think, is oddly counterculture yet safe in a lot of ways, and I think that especially appeals to those interested in the nerdly arts, or those of more introverted people.
So
who want something that's a little more safe.
So how do you tie metal into your love of the nerdly arts? Let's kind of wrap this up, guys. Well, how do you, as you guys are lovers of the nerdly arts, how does metal fit into your love of the nerdly arts?
Don, you can go first.
Oh, I think the easiest way is because you look at take a band like Judas Priest or Metallica. That's the sound of two giant robots kicking each other's ass.
Works for me.
In Judas Priest's case, yeah, they've done actually a few songs about giant robots kicking each other's ass. So there you go.
Yep, that's very true.
Let me finish with a thought here. Don, do you know? You're a fan of Blue Oyster Cult. Okay. Do you know who inspired J.K. Rowling's latest book?
No.
Blue Oyster Cult.
Really?
Her latest book is inspired by songs. Each of the chapters is based around a different song by Blue Oyster Cult.
Oh, yikes.
Yeah.
So much so that my wife said to me, have you heard all these songs? And I had to go back and I'm a huge Blue Oyster Cult fan, I had to go back and look for these deep tracks by Blue Oyster Cult. I was like, I haven't heard that in a long time. So, Harry Potter is as much a part of the nerdly arts as
Well, it wasn't the Harry Potter book. That would be one of her recent mysteries, is John Galbraith, right? Yeah. I can do you one nerdly better, though. Don, tell them about the Defenders comic.
Oh, yeah. There's 2 issues of Marvel's Defenders comic from late 70s. That the story's called The Revenge of Vera Gemini, if that's any hint. And, like, every single thing in it, pretty much every line, is from a Blue Oyster Cult song.
Really?
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow.
The actual dialogue of the comic is all Blue Oyster Cult
song. The actual dialogue of the comic is Blue. Wow.
Yeah, a good chunk of it. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. I guess my connection with metal and the nerdly arts goes back to actually seeing the movie Heavy Metal by Ralph Bakshi.
Yeah, of course.
So that's sort of that's sort of my connection between the nerdly arts and heavy metal. So and the movie was awful, and the music was pretty much glam and hair metal, but there was a charm that I still associate with that, and it was certainly better than Ralph Bakshi's take on Lord of the Rings. So
yes, it was.
Which I would say. So, I think you're right, Rob. Whether people like it or not, there is an intrinsic connection between the nerdly arts and heavy metal. The two have a wonderful and loving symbiotic relationship.
And if anyone ever doubts that, go onto Google and do a search for heavy metal album covers, okay?
Yes.
And look at the image results from that. You will get the widest variety of horror, science fiction, and fantasy images you're going to find anywhere.
Yes. I'm just looking at some right now. My son has a heavy metal, a cover art album book, and I'm just looking at some of them right now. Yes, yes. That's true. Some of the most disturbing imagery you will ever find on an album, and some of the silliest stuff that you will ever find. That's true, Rob. You're right. You're right. So all in all, can we agree that heavy metal is a true nerdly art?
Yeah, indeed it is. And on that note, thank you very much, Richard, for coming and hanging out with us for a while and talking metal. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, gentlemen. It was a blast, and anytime you would like to invite me back, I'd be honored to come back. And
we definitely will, because I know you have some strong opinions about science fiction itself that we'd like to discuss at some point in the future.
That would be my honor and pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen. It was great. Great fun.
Okay. Thanks again, Richard. Any final thoughts, Don?
Oh, no, I'm good.
Okay, so on that note, I'm going to bring this meeting of the Department of Nerdly Affairs to a close. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you want to chime in with your own heavy metal thoughts and experiences and such, and how metal has been a part of your nerdly life, come on and check out the website and comment on our page at obeythedna.com, or come on to our Facebook group, Operatives of the Department of Nerdly Affairs, where you can also talk about metal or whatever other interests you have in the nerdly arts. Good night, all, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye. Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! Come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.